For more on all of this, let's bring in Charles Marino. He's the CEO of Sentinel Security Solutions. He's also a former Secret Service supervisory special agent and former Department of Homeland Security advisor. Charles, this is a dark day in American history, but I have to think that we're going to get through this. First of all, let's just talk a little bit about the overall security at the U.S. Capitol. Do we know why it took so long for Capitol Police and other law enforcement to respond? I think that these images that we have seen are really shocking, that this is our U.S. Capitol and that it could be breached in such a way.
Shocking is right, Lana. Thanks for having me. This was no doubt a national security failure and a very real threat to the continuity of government. We saw that play out. We had the Vice President, Speaker of the House on the floor. We had other House and Senate leadership in the area as well. And similar to the White House, the U.S. Capitol is not a building that you expect to be breached, and especially do not want to have to be in a position where you take it back from an individual, let alone a large group that acted like an insurgency that we saw earlier today. We saw the collapse of the outer, middle, and ultimately the inner perimeter of the security plan based on the determination of the protesters combined with a lack of overall law enforcement resources. So while the Capitol Police were able to slow down the protesters to the inner perimeter of security, eventually they were overwhelmed and the Capitol Police were left with having to evacuate all of the members of Congress and the Secret Service with evacuating the Vice President.
Well, and we know what an exceptional job the Capitol Police do day in and day out. But given your expertise, what do you believe would have been the best way for law enforcement to have de-escalated or handled this situation before it got so out of hand?
Yeah, I think the overall intelligence picture here comes into play in terms of preparation for events like this. So, for example, we knew that there was going to be a rather large rally in the vicinity of the ellipse that the president was going to attend. Unfortunately, the president's rhetoric has to come into that intelligence picture. We know what the president was going to say to his group of supporters, as well as those like Rudy Giuliani, who said, maybe we should have a trial of the election by combat. These words do nothing but incite. So to take all of this into the overall intelligence picture combined with the number of attendees, I think there's probably should have been some more robust security planning to include pushing that perimeter of the U.S. Capitol out even more.
You mentioned that quote from the president's advisor and lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, combat. Obviously, we didn't know that he was going to say that, but we did know that this planned protest was supposed to take place. We knew that President Trump and his supporters have been stoking this unrest. Do you have concerns, given all this, about our nation's national security, given how quickly this turned violent, given how quickly it seemed like law enforcement had to cede control for a moment while they were waiting for reinforcements?
Yeah, well, what it exposes, Lana, is it exposes the vulnerability now our adversaries, they don't necessarily need to be domestic, by the way, saw that a large group of people were able to make their way into what is normally a very secure location. Further than that, we saw an evolution of additional threats take place, like suspicious packages and devices throughout the greater Washington, D.C. area. So that leaves us very vulnerable. But as you said, there was an overall lack of deployment of the National Guard, for example, of other law enforcement agencies like the Metropolitan D.C. Police Department being called in, the Secret Service, the FBI. So this is certainly going to be looked at from a planning standpoint, where you have almost similar to the State of the Union, where it's a national special security event run by the Secret Service. I think a model like that will be looked at going forward, where you have a large amount of leadership and the continuity of government in play at one location at any one time.
And Charles, help us understand a little bit about all the various levels of law enforcement that exist in a situation like this. As you mentioned, National Guard, we've talked about D.C. Capitol Police, there's also the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police. Who is responsible for mobilizing these various aspects of law enforcement, and were they just not called in soon enough?
Yeah, the quick answer is they weren't called in soon enough. They weren't part of the overall security plan in terms of a large cohesive deployment to secure the Capitol during the certification of the election. So as a result, many of these adjoining agencies responded. DC, as you know, is rich with law enforcement agencies. There are numerous agencies that all have specific responsibilities at the federal level, and by far outnumber the local police department at the Metropolitan DC Police Department. So the question is, how do these agencies all come together? Under what construct? If this were to be declared a national special security event today, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, the secretary there would have designated the event as a national special security event. It would have been signed off by the Gang of Eight on the Hill, and the Secret Service would have brought all of these resources together. What we saw today was that the Capitol Police operated like it was every other day at the Capitol. They knew that they had this large adjoining protest group that was going to be on the ellipse to listen to the president, but they operated like they normally did in terms of securing the Capitol, whereas maybe some additional resources should have been brought into the planning process.
So we heard President Trump tape a message to his supporters that were there rioting at the Capitol. He didn't say that he was conceding the election. He continued to peddle this misinformation that he won in a landslide, which we know is false, and much of the rhetoric that actually stoked this emotion, or that at least is that we have heard from many of the violent protesters, the rioters, and this angry mob, that they were believing. Given that the president and his supporters continue to do this, I'm wondering about the future of events like this, and what types of security concerns you think people in charge need to be considering now for the future, if you expect that more of these types of activities might in fact occur, if not at the U.S. Capitol, but at other places throughout the country.
Yeah, like I said earlier, Lana, you're right. I mean, the last person you expect to incite violence is the commander-in-chief. This is a very unique position that we find ourselves, unfortunately, in this country. You can't say, as the president does, that you support law enforcement, but then incite groups to act out against law enforcement and ultimately cause the problems that we saw today for the Capitol Police. That's extremely unacceptable. And then on the flip side, you have the President-elect Biden delivering the message that we would expect from our commander-in-chief, that this is not tolerable behavior from citizens of this country, and also the way forward, and thanking law enforcement, but truly trying to de-escalate. So the fact that we need to take the president's rhetoric into account, and as we prepare for these types of events, I think and hope that is going to be uniquely relayed to the president here. And hopefully we won't have to take that into consideration going forward, which I doubt we will.
Washington, D.C. is now under curfew. What can we expect to see overnight and into the morning?
Yeah, so the mayor of D.C. imposed a 6 p.m. curfew. They'll let that go over 6 p.m. I think they'll start to enforce that and become more and more strict over time. So we'll see a lot of the resources, the National Guard, Metropolitan D.C. Police Department, impose that curfew and try and de-escalate and break up the crowd to make sure there's no more problems in D.C. But it will certainly take time. Also, I know that Congress wants to get back tonight to consider the process of certifying the electoral vote. But unfortunately, the Capitol is a very large building. We had people in there that we don't know who they are. So they're going to be clearing that building. It's going to take some time. So I think let's get these people off of the street. Let's get them home, travel back to where they came from. Let's get the Capitol cleared, make sure there's no other issues there. And then hopefully tomorrow is another day.
All right, Charles Marino, thank you.
Thanks, Lana.